Okay. Hello, and welcome to another episode of LGOtv Big Talk. And why Big Talk? Because I hate small talk. My guest today is one of my favorite humans on the planet, Jonathan Fields. I'm so excited to have you here.
So excited to be here with you.
So, Jonathan, you are a dad, a husband, an award winning author, an executive producer, and host of the top ranked Webby nominated Good Life Project podcast, which is one of my favorites. You are the founder and CEO of Spark Endeavors and the chief architect behind Spark Types, a tool tapped by nearly half a million individuals and organizations to identify and embrace and cultivate work that makes people come alive and equip organizations and leaders to inspire extraordinary work. I love the Sparketype assessment. And in the lead up to this conversation, I've been searching and searching and searching in my email to find the Sparketype assessment that I took when you first launched this.
Mhm.
I think like
Right.
maybe 2 years ago, possibly, maybe
Yeah,
even
the end of
more.
20 actually.
Yeah, and I couldn't find it, and so I took the test again, and I was, very excited to see that I am still I think I remember that I was an advisor the first time, and I can't remember what the second one was, but I'm an advisor and an essentialist.
Mm, and did that resonate with you?
Yes, absolutely. I am I'm a Jewish mother. I love giving advice to people. I mean, that's of course my thing. And I also was weaned early on in my career in doing presidential events, throwing events, creating, these massive events, but like the cue to cue of what happens every minute and every moment. And so,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, the essentialist, that's me. Absolutely.
Right, which is all about creating order from chaos. So it's like you take
Yes.
massive things that are going on all around you and somehow you make them you distill them into a level of
To organizations, to companies, to CEOs. But you know what terrifies me is the white space. Like, I like taking the chaos and making it into order, but, like, the white space of, like, this could be anything scares the shit out of me, but I think you like that, right? You're a maker. That's your thing.
that that is my type, yeah. In fact, I wake up in the morning and I'm kind of like, what can I create that doesn't exist on any given day? I love the white space. I don't love it when something already exists and I'm asked to optimize it or fine tune it or refine it. I'll do it. It's cool. I can rise to that occasion. But my favorite thing is to go from zero to something, to go from idea to thing. Whether that thing is, as a kid, I was a painter. I don't even know if you know that. And or whether it was, a company, whether it's a book, whether it's an experience, the amazing part for me is to go from idea to thing, and for a maker, that's what it's all about. That is the primary impulse for effort. But if you're not that wiring, it actually can kind of terrify a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. The whiteboard, the empty whiteboard terrifies me. When somebody comes at me with, like, their big, hairy, audacious goal, the thing that they don't even wanna say it out loud, they just, like, whisper it 'cause they have such reverence for it, they're so excited by it, but they're so overwhelmed by it, like, that's I love that, like, I love helping people figure out their next step, but if you're just like, "Go anywhere," I'm almost overwhelmed by the options, and I'm not that creative of a human, which is what I've learned, like, I I'm just not, and people are sort of shocked by that, but so when did you know that you were creative? 'Cause in preparing for this, and I've now known you for years, I mean, I've listened to a lot of your podcasts, I've read all of your books, but I watched a talk you gave where you called yourself Freaky Fields.
Hmm.
When did you know you were Freaky Fields, that you were just different, that you were unusual?
Well, and that's not entirely related to the maker impulse, but I knew, we're all different, right? But I think so many of us, we have things that make us weird.
Yeah.
But in the culture, the rule is if the thing that makes you weird is not in some way rewarded or exalted, then stifle it,
Yes.
because you don't want to stand out. And then, especially when you hit your teen years, the last thing you want to do is stand out. You just want to fit in.
Yeah.
So you end up giving up so much of who you are, that thing that makes you kind of different, in the name of belonging. And belonging is important. I absolutely acknowledge that. But instead of trying to fit into a group that wants you to change to their norms, real belonging comes when you actually step into what makes you different, when you completely own it, And then you find people or communities that absolutely revel in those very things so that there's no changing, there's no morphing or conformity that needs to happen for you to be okay. So for me, I didn't learn that lesson until pretty late in life. I was raised the son of kind of like a mad professor. He was my dad. Spent had one job his entire career, and continues with that job even though it's not his sort of full time job anymore. He was a research psychologist. He ran a lab researching human cognition, the human learning process, and he loved it, was madly passionate about it, but was like that typical, just always in his head, loved what he was doing. And um, my mom was a maker, a pure maker. She was a potter when I was a kid, and the basement of her house was this sort of phantasmagorical pottery studio, and she would just steal away down there for hours and days making things. And it was rows and rows of jars of different powders and colors, and I tended much more towards that side, although I've realized now, sort of more in adult life, that I have both of those
Yes.
impulses in me because I'm actually a maker scientist, which is sort of like both parents literally folded into me. But I knew that I saw the world differently from the earliest days because when I expressed it, it often wasn't received well, and that was, it caused a lot of pain. So Freaky Fields, was not a badge I wear with honor now. Like when I was a kid, there was, a season of sixth grade where that was my nickname, but not in a kind way,
Yes.
and it took a long time to sort of realize, probably well into my late 30s, that the things that made me different were actually the things to be most celebrated, and they also would end up being the things that on a work level, on a professional level, on a contribution level, would be my greatest assets. They would my the way that I saw the world differently, and the way that that would lead to ideas that would lead to things, was what would allow me to come at things different and make things that weren't made before.
I love I have so many thoughts and comments from what you just said. It's interesting. Do you find that a lot of people's sparketype is a combination of both of their parents in some way? Because even as you're saying that, I was like, my mother was definitely an advisor. Absolutely. I mean, traditional Jewish mother, like told everybody what to do. Like, and even if you asked her, if you didn't ask her. Um, but also just in her vocation, just all the things that she did, there was always the advising type. My father, they're both still alive. I'm speaking about them in past tense because they're retired. But my father was a surgeon. If it hurts, cut it
Mm.
out. Right? Like doesn't get any more essentialist than being a surgeon. I mean, that's pretty much it. So I'm curious. I hadn't thought about that, and I didn't think about my parents and sort of who they are. Do you find as you're seeing people take this assessment that you can't fight City Hall, that we're sort of a product of where we came from?
So it's interesting, right? I actually haven't done that analysis, but it would be kind of fascinating. But here's the catch with that. What we see on the surface very often is not the primary impulse for effort
Mm,
underneath the surface. So, for example, if you look at your mom, you're like, well, she's clearly an advisor. Um, the underlying impulse very often is different than what we see on the surface. So, she could actually be what we call a nurturer. A nurturer is one of these 10 archetypes. And the primary impulse for nurturing is giving care. You want to elevate and make sure everyone feels taken care of, seen, heard, elevated. It's a very largely empathic impulse. Um, and it's also the reason why, if you literally look at any job, any role that exists where people are doing it, like for your dad, for example, you could say, well, there's a lot of essentialist in there. Like there's a lot of creating order from chaos, but you could also say he's a maker, depending on the type of surgery. Maybe he loves the process of the creative act of surgery, and it can be a profoundly creative act. You know, he could be somebody who is a scientist who loves complex problem solving. He loves to figure out what's actually wrong here and how can I solve this in the most elegant possible way. So what's interesting is what I learned over time is that you can never really look at the quote job, the title, the
mhm,
role on
mhm.
the surface, and know the impulse without actually either having a fairly in-depth conversation with somebody, or it's also the reason why we built the assessment, to kind of help get there. So it's been fascinating to me to learn one of the big awakenings that we've seen with now, around 500,000 people having completed this thing and 25 million data points is that you can never really know. I've facilitated a number of workshops and leadership programs and strategy groups where I'd be around a table with 8 people for 3 straight days. And at the end, I remember one group basically saying to me, "So we want you to go around the table and tell each of us what you think our archetype is." And I was like, ah, because what I've learned is that what people express on the surface and very often what they devote years to, and it doesn't always match the deeper impulse for effort. So it's not always so easy to tell what that is.
Mm, mm. So let's talk about that in context of growing up, right? Because I, I I often ask people, about their childhoods, and as you do, I know, the sort of the biographical interview was so interesting. Where did you grow up? Who are your parents? What did you think you wanted to be when you grew up? What caused you joy? And I think there's a real difference between were you loved growing up and were you seen growing up, right? Because like for a lot of us, love was sort of this transactional thing. Like you get good grades, you're,
Mm.
polite in front of, house guests, like all those things. And it's like you're loved for that. Like you did good, you're a good person. But it takes a long time before we can really unfurl that freak flag, right? And like be that person. So when you were called Freaky Fields at 6th grade, it's not kind. Everybody wants to be different. Everyone, I was gonna say everyone wants to be special, but nobody wants to be different.
Mm.
You said it took you a long time in life to realize that that was actually part of what made you special. How did that happen for you? How did you realize that that thing that you tried to hide was actually the light inside of you?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think for me, there was, sometimes when you ask that question, there's an inciting incident. There's an aha moment. There's like one big thing where someone's like, "Oh, this is it," and it's actually a good thing, and I need to lean into it. For me, I feel like it was more just a gradual evolution. But one of my creative expressive media is writing. In fact, as much as a lot of people probably know me these days for audio, for my voice, for podcasting, and what we produce, um, I still feel that writing is my primary maker medium right now. Um, and I've known that for a long time. Although I'm also very, very drawn to the physical act of creation. So probably it was the identification with the physical act of creation that was the first real "this is me" type of thing, and that
And when
showed
was
up.
that? What yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that showed up in the earliest days. I was making things from the time I was a little kid, but I was doing the act over and over and over, but I wasn't necessarily, sitting there at, 13 years old saying, "Oh, this is the thing that fills me up. I'm here to do." I mean, I grew up in a water town. I grew up, if you've ever read The Great Gatsby,
Yes.
East Egg is actually based on a real town called Port Washington, which is the town I grew up in. It's a little peninsula on the water. The end of my block was a beach, and we had the classical town dump. And one of my favorite things to do when I was a kid was I would kind of beg a parent to drive me down to the dump. I'd go searching, scavenging for bikes and bike parts, and we'd come home with like an old Chevy Blazer in the back filled with bike parts, and I'd pull them out of the car. I'd load them onto the driveway. I'd get a whole bunch of tools and a whole bunch of duct tape, and just piece together these Franken bikes. With like 3 sets of forks that went like to make a massive chopper and giant bars and then, we just ride them around until they fell apart, and, like, God willing, you didn't get too damaged when that happened because you knew there was a decent chance you'd be in the air jumping something when it did.
And you just gave them to friends? It's just you and friends, or were this is like a
It
little
or
business
yeah,
you started,
it
or
no, I would just ride them around myself, and
okay.
I was constantly building things, and also, that was probably the same time where I started painting, and for me, I was always my hands always have to be doing something, so I was the doodler in class. I was filling pages with more doodles than notes, and there was a time where I think this was probably when I was a kid, my grandfather passed, and he was like, very fancy trial lawyer, and, I never had an interest in law, and I guess when we were going through his stuff, we found this beautiful old wooden case filled with paint. acrylic and oil paint and palettes and brushes. And like nobody knew what to do with it. So I grabbed it and I just started painting. And I never took lessons. I just, that pottery studio in the basement that I described, there was one corner where I stacked up a whole bunch of old clay boxes. I took an old door and I threw it on top of them and a swing arm lamp and created like my painting table. And I would just vanish away there for days, experimenting and playing and trying all sorts of different things. So I think it was, it expressed itself really early in just cobbling together anything I could. But I think it really started to show up in painting when I was in high school. And I realized then, I think, that the act of creation was something that was powerful for me, that was important to me. It made me feel a certain way. It made me lose time. When I talk about this state of being sparked, because a lot of people use the word spark in a lot of different ways, it's fairly nebulous, and we kind of want to go the extra mile of defining, like, what am I actually talking about when I talk about it? And there are 5 components that, because I start to deconstruct it, what is that feeling that I feel when I feel like I'm doing the work that I'm here to do? And one of those components is being able to more easily access a state of flow, where a sense of self merges with the activity, where you lose a sense of time. It either slows down profoundly or speeds up profoundly. Um, and all those things started to happen to me. I felt like what I was doing, oddly, even if nobody ever saw it, would matter. It mattered to me. Like, I was doing something that I felt good about because there was an impulse in me that was getting satisfied. Um, so for me, I think, it showed up in the really, really early days, but I think I became more consciously aware of how that impulse made me feel probably in my high school years. But at the same time, what I'll tell you is, right around then, a sense of self-judgment and perfectionism also touched down. So I would work for days on a canvas, or I actually started to make money, painting album covers on jean jackets in high school when, like, album covers were the greatest art ever.
Yes.
And I would work days and days and days on something, and if it wasn't exactly perfect, if it wasn't what the vision that I had in my mind, and of course, most of the time it wasn't, because I was young. I hadn't developed the craft to express in the world the vision that I saw in my head. Um, I would just throw it up or tear it out. I would trash the canvas. Um, and so it's interesting that those two, the impulse and the expectation, or the over expectation, really cemented themselves at a similar time.
What's fascinating to me about the perfectionism piece is that if I were to describe you to somebody else, I would say that you are one of the few humans I know who truly always is wherever his feet are. You're just always so present in the moment. Like, I feel like you slow time down in this way that when I talk to you, when I'm with you, when I'm listening to a podcast, when I'm reading your books, I just feel like it's almost this outer calm sort of descends on me until it becomes inner calm. So to hear that you struggle with this idea of perfection when being in the moment really is about letting go of that future idea and that perfection and just seeing where the journey takes you. I'm so interested in how you got from perfectionism to this place where you are right now. I mean, that's a real maturity.
Yeah, I think I got brought to my knees a whole lot over the years. I'm not a kid. I'm 55. I've been knocked down a lot, and I have had plenty of moments where my standards have harmed me physically, have harmed me emotionally, psychologically. And I think at some point you have to listen, um, and I have a 10-year daily meditation practice. And I think that's been huge for me. I didn't start it because, I had a perfectionism, and I probably never even understood what the word perfectionism was about, and didn't acknowledge that it was in any meaningful way a part of my experience of life and contribution to work. Um, but in hindsight, I can see it was definitely there, and it drove me on the one hand to really devote myself to craft no matter what I did. But on the other hand, the expectation that I would be at a level of craft or contribution way faster than any human being should expect themselves to be, cause a lot of suffering. And I think while I didn't come to meditation in any way, shape, or form because of this, I came to it for a profoundly different reason. Um, it has softened the edges in a pretty dramatic way. I think a combination of seasoning and just age. I think um, being a parent, that if you try and be a perfect parent, you are asking for nonstop suffering.
Yeah, yeah.
You learn to hold everything a little bit more gently, because at some point you just have to own the fact that I'm just showing up and doing the best I can. And over time, I hope I keep learning a little bit more and getting a little bit better. Um, so I think it's a combination of being knocked down a whole bunch of times, and also coming back and realizing that, part of like I'm fascinated by this word. Like spark is one word I'm fascinated by, but grace is another word that I'm
Mhm.
absolutely fascinated by. And and I think that maybe at this point in my life, sort of like I'm balancing those two aspirations and seeing where they blend actually. Um, but to me, grace is this place that you enter not when you've done the perfect thing, but when you have allowed everything to be as it needs to be, and you accept that in the moment. And that's not always easy. In fact, often it's brutally hard. Um, and it's not something that anyone I know touched down with that capability. It's something that I think you sort of you come to over time, and it often doesn't cross different domains. You gain a bit more access to it in one space, and then it's never accept. So you may gain more access to that as a parent, over time, but then professionally you don't allow yourself the conditions for grace in any way, shape, or form. So, um, I think over time I've also learned that it is as a maker, the craft part of whatever I'm doing is really important to me. So I just finished writing my next book, and to me, there's a lot of hopefully valuable information in it. But in a weird way, what's actually more important to me is that I know that, like on page 39, the fourth line is a line that I couldn't have written the way that I wrote it 5 years ago. And I think my time horizon in terms of my expectation has extended a lot. And I've settled into the notion that I'm okay if it takes me 10 years to learn how to write a paragraph in a way that finally matches that vision of the way I want the words to be in my head. Um, and I'll read a book by a master, or I'll look at a painting, or I'll look at some graphic design, or something, that I want to do and that I'm investing in developing the craft around it. And I'll say to myself, I'm not there. My guess is it'll probably take me 10, 15 years to get even close to that. But how cool is that? That I actually have something to devote myself to and that I have the opportunity to grow into something for that window of time. And then when I get there, there's going to be a whole new threshold that's another 10, 15 years down the road. And I've learned to be a lot less frustrated by that and a lot more intrigued and inspired by it.
This is what I'm calling wonder hell. That moment where you're like, I've just seen, I've glimpsed, I had this inkling, I sniffed a potential new me, right? The next thing that I could do. And it's not like bigger, better, faster, more. It's just another dimension of yourself that you didn't even know you had in you. And I think that's wonderful. And then the hell part comes in when you're like, I wanna live in that space more. I wanna figure out how to get there. I wanna be able to be intentional about being that person who can write that paragraph, who can do that thing. And it's almost like the burden of potential then just kind of like descends on your shoulders. And it was something that you never even felt before. You like had that turn of phrase, and then you're like, why aren't all my paragraphs like that? Now I know that there's another level I can get to. And everything that I've read is all about how to survive this moment of wonder hell, like put your nose to the
Mhm.
grindstone, hustle harder, work hard, lean in, all of that stuff. When in fact, as you said, when you get through this wonder hell, what's on the other side is the next one and the next one and the next one because you keep finding more of who you are. And I do think allowing yourself that state of grace to be in the uncertainty, to be in that liminal space where you're not quite sure where it's going to go and what's going to happen, but you're willing to be uncomfortable for just a little longer to figure it out. And I do think that that comes from, um, not necessarily like a confidence, but just a comfort, right? That if on the other side of this is failure, that's not definitional to who you are. It's just a building block of where you're going to go next. But it's so difficult, right? When you have that perfectionist person in you, right? And you've had this drive built into you about what success should look like and what your career should be. And then you're like, but really, I'm Freaky Fields. And that's who I want to be. And the world's going to be okay with it. So you did actually go into law. You became an attorney. And I know
I
you and I joked around about this because you're a recovering attorney where I was just a recovering law student. So why once you're figuring out that you've got this other piece, you do go into law because you figure you got to have like a conformist job for the conformist world.
Yeah, it was interesting. I So the other thing that I'm fascinated by, and I've always been fascinated by, is the human is wellness. My maker impulse very often has been channeled into what makes life better for human beings, into how do we step into a sense of potential. And I'm also really fascinated by the physical body, the mind and body connection, as so many people call it, in like pretending that they're two different things. I was literally probably minutes away from going to physical therapy school, interestingly enough, rather than law school,
Hmm.
because I could make wellness, and
So
I
even, like,
like, I
back in the '80s, you were because like, you and I just turned 50, we're around the same age. Wellness when we were growing up was like a Diet Coke and snack wells, right? It was, like, better
yeah,
living through
well,
chemistry, so
it was a tab.
yes, yes. So how like, where did I was interviewing somebody, for this, and he was and he told me that his mom, like, got some flyer from some, Eastern guru and started reading this, and she was one of those people who she'd suffered from mental illness her entire life, and she was always searching for, like, the next guru. So suddenly she turned the entire house into, like, the lentil palace, and he was like, "You can imagine coming home when you're in, you know, ninth grade and, like, here's your mom, and she's chanting in the living room, and she's serving you lentils. You're not the most popular kid ever." So, it wasn't a thing when we were growing up. So I'm curious how you even found wellness to start.
Well, I definitely didn't use the word wellness when
Sure.
I was a kid, but I think I saw it around me in my mom to a certain extent. In that, so my mom was a potter. She's a maker. She's also kind of like a hippie. Um, when I was really little, I grew up in the household where the end of the hall was a poster that said "Make love, not war." Um, and so I was always around people sort of like, I think in the early days, exploring the fringes of how do I live well? How do I make cool stuff? How am I okay in the world? And I think that rubbed off on me.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it also showed up in, I was a gymnast when I was a kid. Also, I'm pretty competitive, and um, and I was constantly pushing my physical body to try and figure out where is the edge of my potential, and that is a question which like is with me to this day. Like, where
Yes.
is the edge of my potential? But also more broadly, on a at scale on a societal level, like what if we all asked the question, where's the edge of my potential, and then explore that. And I think wellness is one of those edges, so performance is one edge, well-being is one edge, physical well-being, psychological, emotional well-being, like where is the edge of potential in all of those different contexts and domains? And that I certainly wouldn't have used any of that language when I was younger, but that's always been a big part of me. So, and I've always been just very, very physically oriented. I mentioned, where it showed up in my body as a gymnast, as a cyclist, as a rock climber, but also in the physical act of creation. While I write now, I actually took a month off 3 years ago to go out to Amish country, Pennsylvania, and live on top of an old rehabbed roadhouse to work with a luthier to learn to build an acoustic guitar because I realized that I was so missing the physical act of creation. So there's a physicalization that has been a part of my life for a long time. And part of that physical act of creation sometimes is the physical act of creating your own body, your own well-being, and how other people approach that. So I think that was that impulse. The reason that I chose law school instead of that was, I think, in no small part because in college, I went to Binghamton. Back then, we called it SUNY Binghamton. Now it's just called Binghamton University. Um, and I didn't really ever go to class. Um,
Me neither.
an absolutely terrible student because another passion has stayed with me for life. I love, love, love music, and I was the lemonade stand kid also. So one of the things that I've constantly created is businesses and companies for my entire life. So I brought those together in college, and I created a mobile disc jockey and entertainment company. So I spent all of my time in college working till 3 a.m., like 3 or 4 nights a week at clubs and at parties, basically creating an experience as a DJ. And then as we built it into a larger company. Um, and that was the first company I sold actually when we graduated. And I realized when I got out, like proudly waving my transcript, which I think was like a C plus average. And I was really lucky. um, there's something in me that said, I really, I've kind of screwed around. I learned a ton about business, about what I'm capable of doing, and I learned a tremendous amount about human psychology through the act of being a DJ and learning how to literally control the dynamic of hundreds or thousands of people for hours. Um, but there was something in me that sensed that I was capable of more intellectually. And at the end of the day, I thought law school would be a really effective way for me to test that, to see what am I really capable of? What can I make happen? I had no idea whether I'd ever enter the practice of law, which I did. But so when I showed up at law school, it was primarily because I knew that no matter what happened afterwards, I would probably gain a set of skills that would be super valuable to me no matter what I did. Um, if I practiced afterwards and I found a way, a path in the law, that would be great. But it wasn't a foregone conclusion at all. So when I showed up for law school, I was on a mission, and I quickly became the absolute geek who, like bolted myself to the table on, like in the back corner of the library and never left, and I worked really hard and I also got really lucky and I did, really well in law school and graduated in a place where I had opportunities presented to me when I
Did you
left.
enjoy it? I mean, did you like, as
Yeah.
somebody who's always been physical and has always been experimental and creative, did you enjoy the process of bolting yourself to the desk, or was that just
So
a drive?
yeah, oddly, the one thing pretty much that I allowed myself not to be there for was to work out. So I was one of those weirdos who was also in the probably the best shape of my life during law school.
Mm.
um, there was a gym right around the corner, and I was sort of like bounced between the two places. Um, but yeah, when I actually, I was also that weirdo that actually probably really enjoyed law school because I knew why I was there. I was on a mission to accomplish something. I was very purpose oriented.
Hmm.
It wasn't, I also took a couple years off between college and law school just to kind of kick around. I actually took some of the money from that first, like tiny business sale, and I spent 3 months backpacking and diving down the east coast of Australia. Came back, like worked in outside sales, and learned how absolutely horrible I was at that.
Yeah.
And so when it came, I didn't go there, but you know, because of the reason that a lot of people go out of, directly out of college, which is that I'm not quite ready to enter the world, and this seems kind of cool, so I'm going to do it.
Mm.
I went there with I was much more on a mission, and it's also, it's a substantial investment. So I wanted to make sure that I was getting something real and also creating opportunities from it, whether I would end up, taking those or not.
So were your parents relieved, like, "Thank God Jonathan's back on track," or were they worried, like, he's losing
Uh,
his
uh,
thing?
yeah, I think like hippie Potter mom, I think could care less if I was. I mean, she's also a Jewish mom, so it's nice to be able to say my son, the lawyer,
Right.
right? So that's so
And
yeah, I'm sure
was she the daughter of the
the
grandfather of the
lawyer.
trial attorney?
Yeah,
Okay, so okay.
yeah. But so yeah, I think she was proud. I think she was, like they were, um, and my dad was like such a hardcore academic. I think he was proud that I was continuing my studies. Like
Yes.
really, especially after coming out of college with a not very admirable transcript.
Right.
Um, how I got into law school in the first place, honestly have no idea. I think if I tried now, it would be kind of an instant rejection. Um, but I never actually had that sort of. I know a lot of people talk about their parents having these expectations and pressure about like what they should be doing in the appropriate course. Never really had that from my folks. So it wasn't really about them. It was really entirely about me wanting to develop a set of skills I knew would be valuable no matter what I did, and really testing what I was intellectually capable of, because um, I knew that I learned a ton about building companies. But I just I kind of knew that there was so much more I was capable of that I was a slacker in the academic arena and in the sort of the intellectual arena. And I wanted to, I think, show myself that I was capable of more.
So I know that you get asked all the time who your favorite guests are on your podcast. So I'm not going to ask you that because I know it's like picking your favorite children, right? Like they're all different in different ways. But I am curious if there are people who have been on your podcast that either you've been totally intimidated by or maybe jealous of, like, not jealous of like, "Oh, they're successful, I'm not," but just, like, their ability to make a thing, to do a thing, they sort of reach that next level that you haven't quite gotten to. Or if there's some that you've just learned so much from that you go back to and listen to them and dig deeper. I know that's sort of a three-part
Yeah.
question, but I'm sort of interested in those types of guests.
Yeah, and it won't surprise you to know that those guests are generally makers.
Yes.
um, because they show me the way, and they're generally, either my age or older than me. I've always tended to seek wisdom from people who are sort of, closer to the source. Um, and so the one person, and as you said, it's never a matter of favorite. Like, I literally have one of the things I've learned is that there's no human being on the planet that I cannot be a student of. Um,
Mhm.
every life, reveals something to every other life. That's just the way it is. It's just a matter of whether you're willing to pay attention or not. Um, but in terms of people where there's just been a sense of profound resonance, there've been a handful of people. The one that most immediately comes to mind is somebody who passed away last year at the age of 91, um, and that was Milton Glaser. So if you're in the world of design, he's iconic. Everybody knows his name. He he designed the single most ripped off logo in the history of logos, I Heart NY. He wrote that, as legend has it, on a napkin or a piece of paper in the back of a cab in the late 70s, and then gave it to the city as a gift, because most people don't, a lot of people don't know that in the 70s, New York City was on the brink of bankruptcy. It
New
was a
York City was a rough
disaster.
place in the
It
'70s.
was a really rough place in the 70s. And Milton grew up in New York City. He went to Bronx Science, like classic, public school, and he had a love affair with New York City, the way that many people who grew up there do. And becoming a really fantastic designer, he wanted to design this one thing that expressed his love, in the hope that he would actually be able to have that become an emblem for other people to express their love too. So he designs the Arhart logo in the back of it. He gives it to New York. There's no money that ever passed hands for that logo. So the single most iconic logo and most ripped off and copied logo in history, was given freely, which I thought was a profound act. He's one of the co-founders of New York Magazine. He lived his life. He taught for decades, I think 4 or 5 decades at Cooper Union. So he taught, thousands of the designers who have now shaped the way that we interact with nearly every part of our world. So the legacy that he made, with the way that he was willing to share his wisdom and his knowledge, is astonishing. And as a maker and a studio and an artist, um, he lived his life exactly the way he wanted to. He could have easily grown a massive agency, as many people with his level of craft did. But he didn't. He kept a small studio in the city. He had a townhouse. And he had, like a handful of designers that worked with him in his studio. And when I met him, he was, I believe, 86 years old. We sat down in his studio, And we had this amazing conversation. And in the room surrounding us in the studio were all these little things that he had, physical objects, paintings, logos, icons, like everything from like the I Heart and My logo to there's a classic poster of Dylan from the 70s with rainbow hair and profile, and which is like this iconic thing. Y- You can't even begin. So many people know his work, even if you don't know him as a designer. Millions and millions of people know and have been touched by his work. And the way that he chose to live his life and to keep things in a certain scale and know that his impact um, would come from his ability to create what he needed to create and the ripple that would create when it goes out into the world. He was married, until the day he died. He spent part of his week in New York City and then part of his week up in Woodstock with his wife. If you went to the local bread shop in Woodstock, the sign that hung out front, the logo was designed by Milton
Hmm.
because that was the local bread shop. So there's an ethos. He was also deeply real, and he would tell it like it is. He was not a sugarcoating guy. Um, so when I sat down with him and we had a conversation, he immediately was disagreeing with even the way that I was posing questions, but he did it in a way that was okay and allowed me to re-examine my like emerging craft of conversation, and creating experiences for people. Um, so he was looking at the way that he lived his life, the choices that he made, the impact that he had, made a really powerful impact on me.
I've been doing this deep dive into luck as one of the chapters for Wonder Hell
Mm,
about making your own luck. And I know, in order to live a good life, you have your 5 Bs, right? And be intentional, be open, be kind, be you, be still. And I think the be open one is such an interesting one because from everything I've learned, Richard Wiseman, all of the stuff that's been written about luck is being open is a way like people are luckier when they're open to new experiences or open to new people. And just to be able to have this moment where you're sitting down with this man who is so iconic, whose work is so iconic, who as a maker yourself, you are in awe of, and be open to his criticism and his feedback as opposed to wanting to come and impress him, I think is such a beautiful thing. And it's something that I see in your newsletter. I love getting your newsletter, and what I love about it is that it is all at once down to earth and also aspirational. It's wise, but it also has like the naivete and the adventurous spirit of a beginner's mindset. It's soulful. But also light. It urges social action, but it also like tells people to do it from where they are, and it's cool, and I love that. But my favorite part about your newsletter, I have to say, is that you have a different selfie every time. It's like, I don't know if you just, like, take the selfie right before you send it, and I didn't notice it until a couple of months ago, and then I went back and I looked at them, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, that's so cool." And I'm interested why you do that. I think I know, but I'm interested why you do that.
um, 'cause my producer makes me.
Why did your producer
No.
decide to make you? I guess maybe that's a
Yeah,
better
no,
question.
why I do it is, again, to remind me that, like, like, at the end of the day, on Freaky Fields, like, none of those selfies are posed. They're not good shots. They're all terrible shots. They're silly shots. They're dorky shots. They're, like, whatever, and, yeah, I actually literally take them, like, moments before we
Right,
send
like,
out
you
the
clearly haven't, like, done Facetune, you haven't, edited the
Yeah,
lighting, you just, like, you take it and it's whatever your facial expression is, whatever
yeah.
hat you have on your head or mask you have on your face, and you're like, either you're in Boulder, you're in New York City, you're wherever, and you just
Yeah,
send.
and I kind of because, I think social media culture is the opposite, and I just want people to know that, it's okay to just feel what you're gonna feel in the moment and to share that, in a meaningful way, and again, I think it's my constant reminder maybe that perfectionism is not what it's about, it's just about being present, it's about showing up and being human. I think especially right now, we are in a season of dehumanization that
Mm.
starts with ourselves. We judge ourselves in a way that actually literally dehumanizes us to us, and then there's a lot of rhetoric and a lot of dynamic, in society right now, which makes it sadly easier to take on the dehumanization of other people, which I think is absolutely horrendous. And I think for me, it's just kind of reminding people I have good days, I have bad days. I'm a dork just like everybody else. I am at my heart freaky fields. Um, and that's okay, and that can be relatable, and that you can show up as that person. And there are days where, like, I write about tough things in that newsletter, and I tend not to sugarcoat. And if I'm really feeling something deeply, I share it. And I'm like, and if I don't have an answer, I say I don't have an answer. You know, I always try and invite somebody to think about, or do something. Sometimes I just don't know. I mean, the last couple of weeks, I'm in Colorado now, and I'm not in town. We bugged out of town, but I was in Boulder last week, which is where we are. Um, how do you write about something like that and be all hopey and aspiration? And it's like, you know what? This is just really bad, and I'm in like a weird place of being like a longtime New Yorker, but we've been in Colorado since September. Um, being in that middle ground where we're sort of like we're kind of in the town, but not quite of it yet. So you don't entirely know how to allow something like that to land. Um, so how can I write about something that doesn't just speak truthfully to the way I'm feeling in that moment? And what I've learned is that and this has been kind of interesting for me to learn, is that my gift as a writer is not in telling people what to do. My gift as a writer is empathy and craft. My gift is the ability to know how I feel, is the ability to understand how other people are feeling, and to maybe give language to that moment and to that feeling in a way that's hard to access. And in doing that, if I can help people give language to themselves and then have language to share with others to express what's going on, you know, that's it for me. It's not so much rah-rah, it's not so much aspiration and inspiration and, like, "We're gonna get through this, and here are the 5 things to do to help you," which is great. It's just it's not my jam.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and I think a lot of it comes down to, um, writing as a tool for both creation, but also for connection and belonging, to allow people to feel what they feel, to have language for it, which makes it real, and then also to have the ability to share it more easily, which allows them to feel seen and held.
Yes, yes, again, the difference between being loved and being seen, right? Somebody putting words to feelings that you had.
Yeah.
I
Can I
watched
can I
the
circle back to one thing that you said
yes.
also? You mentioned openness. Um, so footnote on that interview with Milton Glaser. In the final minutes of the conversation, and you can actually hear this on the tape. We we both couldn't edit it out, and we wouldn't have wanted to at the end of the day. His studio was in a townhouse that sat directly on the edge of an elementary schoolyard, and there were windows that opened to that schoolyard. So as we're talking, when you get about halfway through, maybe three quarters of the way in, it's lunchtime, and all the schoolyard floods with children, and you hear the sound of children playing in the background. And I just thought to myself, like, what is an astonishingly fitting metaphor for, like, here's a person like doing the absolute at the peak of his career and has been for decades. Um, and you hear the sound of kids playing like this absolutely open, new, like blank slate-ish type of age. Um, and he's sort of like existing in the ether between them. And I thought it was just such a beautiful, kind of gentle soundtrack that started to run behind our conversation.
Oh, that is so beautiful. That is it is incredible because it is hard to keep yourself in that. Like, the world beats you down, right? It's a tough place, and it's hard to keep yourself in that space of openness and creativity and joy and wonder, and that, anything could happen, anything's possible. So you're working as a lawyer, and you, are interested in wellness, and then one day you're like, "I'm gonna open a yoga studio."
Yeah, well, my body kind of like made that decision for me. After working for about 3 weeks with almost no break, almost no sleep, and feeding myself with all sorts of things that were not healthy for me. We closed a deal. I was in devastating pain. There was something in the middle of my body that was making it hard to breathe, that it was so painful. Within hours, I was in emergency surgery because there was an infection that grew into a large abscess in the middle of my body and ate a hole through my intestine from the outside in. Thankfully, everything turned out fine, but it was a wake-up call for me. I was in a career. I was working at one of the biggest, most prestigious law firms in New York City, making a fantastic salary, status, prestige, money, all the things. And my body was literally saying, "Hmm, no, this isn't your path." Um, it took a while to listen, but I eventually went back to the office after recovering from surgery. But what I knew is that when people would walk by my office, and see me smiling and madly writing things on a legal pad, I was actually writing on my exit strategy. I was making a list of the things I thought would be really cool to do with my life if I could figure out how to sustain myself doing them. And then, as it started to go back to the world of entrepreneurship and wellness, I realized I was going to take a huge financial hit for a while. So I finished out like another close to a year, um, and because I knew I needed to bank a lot of money to support myself because I was going to take a really big hit when I left. And I stayed for as long as I could last. um, and I don't knock the career in any way, shape, or form. There are many amazing, noble people who
Right.
are doing great work in that firm and in the career.
Right for them,
It
just
just
not right for
it
you.
wasn't. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
It's I'm a firm believer that if you don't listen, God sends a louder message. I'm not even religious, but, like, if you don't listen, the messages get louder and louder and louder until, you until they kill you, right? So, like, you gotta listen
Yeah.
at some point. And I remember when you and I first met, it was at this, speaker training, and the funniest thing about that is that you told me afterwards that I walked in and you were like, "This woman has it all together." Because I looked at you and I was like, "Holy shit, I don't belong here." So, like,
Oh
it
my
made
god,
me
I
all
was terrified of you. I
I
was
I
I was like, "You are so put together and confident and strong and funny and accomplished," and I was like, "I'm Freaky Fields."
little did you know that I was just, that I went to computer sleepaway camp when I was 13 years old. So, turns out we're all freaky fields if we just let that happen. But I remember you getting up and telling the story about how you were walking down the street and you were like, I'm gonna sign a lease on the yoga studio.
Yeah, I have auspicious timing,
Yeah. Yeah.
and not necessarily in a good way. When I left the law, the first step out was actually making $12 an hour as a personal trainer to learn the fitness industry. I ended up learning a lot, actually opening my own gym, building that for 2.5 years, selling it to an investor group, and then got really curious about the world of yoga. I'd started to develop my own practice. What I noticed in New York City at the time was there were a lot of great yoga studios, but it was not super accessible to just the average person. So I wanted to create something that was, even though I had no business doing it whatsoever. And yeah, I was living in Hell's Kitchen, married, a new home, 3-month-old baby, and just found this space that was a floor in a 115-year-old building that was a disaster. But it was a couple blocks from home. I could be like back and be with the family. And um, it was perfect, So we signed a 6-year lease for a floor in a building, um, married, new home, 3-month-old baby, the day before 9/11.
Yes.
And obviously woke up the next day as a, like longtime New Yorker. The first thing that goes through everyone's mind is who did I know? Because we all knew somebody, if not
Yes.
multiple people,
Yes.
who never came home that day. And in fact, that
Yes.
was the case with us. And then it was, am I really about to do this? I'm about to start a business in a city that is devastated, as a young, like a husband and father, and homeowner. And it was a tough call, but I also there was something in me that said, you know, the person who we knew who was lost that day was the youngest partner in the firm that was at the top of the one of the towers, had just finished building their dream 6,000 square foot home and had a
Mm,
2.5-year-old and a 9-month-old baby. He didn't plan on not coming home that night, but he never did.
mm.
Um, and it just became clear to me that, we don't have any promises. We never know. We have one shot at this go around. Maybe it works and maybe it doesn't, but stuff like that is recoverable if it doesn't. And I also realized that if I was curious about, opening a yoga center in New York before, there was never a time, where the city needed a
More healing.
place for community and healing and belonging and movement and breath. So we went ahead with it, and it turned into one of the most phenomenal, both business and community, experiences ever. I mean, and at the same time, you want to talk about wonder hell. Um, you know, I would be in there, and I was teaching yoga, which honestly I had no business doing at that point. Um, but we would be like, it would be mat to mat, in a practice room with 60 people with this flowing, hot, sweaty vinyasa yoga. The room was like, these big old cast iron radiators from 115 years old, and the off switch was broken off. There was no thermostat in the room, so when the building decided to turn them on, they were on, and the room was like pouring with heat, and people were in there and just like sweating out like the fear and the tears and the sadness, um and moving in synchronicity together. And I was walking around the room. It was like back in my DJ days where there was this there was an energy that was like connect every single person in breath and movement and flow, and it was magical. It was like we all went somewhere else, and then everyone would go home. I'd lock the front door and I'd plunge the toilet and sweep the floors and run the business and worry about like paying people's paychecks and all this other stuff. And it's sort of like these simultaneous things where you've got these like sheer magic happening. Um, and then the grind of reality underneath it. And like Tara Brock says, this too.
This too. This too. And, eh, there is as a business owner, people always talk about like, "Oh, you have to be working on the business, not just in the business," and all of that stuff, but sometimes it's wanting to just swim more in the wonder and the joy and the magic that's there. But then you also are like, ho did you was there part of you that said, "This is good, I like this, I'm gonna stick with this," or did you think, "I need to do more of this, how do we bring more people in? How do I spread this to more people?" Or was it sort of from the outside, just having too many people didn't fit in a room, you had a wait list? Like, where did the urge to grow and to then build out Good Life Project come from?
Yeah, well, I mean, initially the urge to grow like stayed in the yoga studio. We tried to franchise. We actually opened a few test franchises, and my vision became to have like the first sort of like national standardized franchise of yoga. I learned really quickly that was a bad idea. um, it was not the thing that was supposed to happen in that particular space. Good Life Project came a number of years down the road. So I ran that center, and owned it, and eventually, it was, thankfully, grew into not just a beautiful community, but also a very, a thriving business. And came a time where my Jones to Write, really started to take the lead, and I was very fortunate. I We had a lot of media connected with the yoga center, and I was able to sell my first book to a traditional, publisher,
And
and
that was
and I kinda
Career
realized.
Renegade.
Yeah, and so I was like, I had a foot out the door, then, and I also realized that everything the franchise side of it, it just didn't work, it didn't make sense, it was gonna be too hard to do, and when I stepped away from that, I kinda realized that, like 7 years in, I didn't wanna spend the rest of my life running a single studio. There were other things that I wanted to do, and I started to check out, and you can't have something like that, where it's not just a business, but it's a community.
Did you
If
did you did you start to check out there were other things you wanna do because you'd made this? Like, once it was made, were
Yeah.
you were jonesing to make again?
Yeah, in
Yep.
hindsight, absolutely. The primary creative act for me was just not there on a level that was
Yes.
satisfying my impulse anymore. And there were other things that I wanted to do. Um, so I was in a fortunate position to be able to actually sell the business. And but I still remember to this day. I remember teaching my last class, and my students didn't know that was my
Mm.
last class, and bringing them up out of shavasana, and then telling them, and it was wow. Um, I didn't think I would be affected, but I was. It's really hard. It's easy to sell a business. It's hard to leave a community. Um,
Yes.
so,
Yes.
and I kind of slowly made my way out and stayed in touch with a lot of people and started writing, and wrote a couple of books. And Good Life Project started in the beginning of 2012. And my primary question was really, well, I want to create something new, new forms of media that I hadn't done before. It actually started as video before we transitioned to audio. Um, and I fairly quickly realized that there's no real reason that I don't have any Jones to be on camera. And we weren't doing things that I felt where it was important for me to be on camera. And I fell in love with audio. So we went all in on audio popped, before podcasting really popped. And people thought I was nuts because we were growing a pretty big video channel. And I transitioned away from it pretty quickly. And we got really lucky timing wise in that, our podcast, we went all in on audio just a few months before Serial hit, which completely changed the landscape of podcasting. And we've ridden that wave, from the whole time and never stopped producing. But we also, because I have such a focus on craft, we were producing the highest production value video that we could produce. We were shooting like on location with a 3-camera crew. And then when we switched to audio, we were doing everything in person in studio for 6 years to keep the value in the craft. I want to be, it's Milton Glaser. I don't want to do anything unless it's something I'm truly proud of, and craft really matters to me. So, but the fundamental idea was to exalt this question, which has been dogging me for 2.5 decades, which is how do we live a good life? Where is the edge of our potential? How do we find it in a way that is, that allows us to step back into our humanity rather than eviscerating it? And it is, it touches pretty much everything that I do at this point, whether it's Good Life Project, whether it's, the Sparketypes and that whole body of work as that's emerging. That's sort of the common theme.
I have a million more questions to ask you, but I only asked you for an hour of your time, so I want to respect that. So let me end by asking this, which is not actually a simple question. So I'm sorry ahead of time, but I've got you. You're trapped, so I'm going to ask you anyway. It does living a good life can be for some people always pushing that edge. What are you made of? What is your potential? Can you do more? Can you make more? Can you be more? For some people, it's going to be being happy where you are right now. How do we figure out which person we are as we're trying to figure out how do we live our own good life?
Yeah, I think the unifying thread in both of those experiences, is not to be happy where you are, but to be present where you are.
Mhm.
I'm
There you
I'm
are
not a
again, standing where your feet are. There you
right.
are.
I'm not. I'm pretty well versed in the literature around happiness and the science around it, and some of the I know many of the primary researchers in the field. I'm more interested in meaning, how we make meaning, um, and increasingly, I think probably in no small part through meditation, and talking to a lot of people who've been the most quote successful in their domains,
Mhm.
and have gone through profound windows of unhappiness and sadness. And um, to me, it is more about understanding what is that primary impulse for contribution in your life. That's the whole Sparketype body of work for me. Um, and then how do I pursue it in a way that allows me to feel fully expressed and alive? And then the third element is, what do I need to do? What inner and outer scaffolding do I need to create in order to allow myself to be as present in every moment along the way, and not constantly be in pursuit of the hit that's somewhere out there, but actually knowing that it's great to aspire to growth, but not at the cost of eliminating presence in the experience that you're in today. So to me, it's more about how can I be present now, and then in the next minute, and the next minute, and I'm going to aspire the whole time. But even if I never hit the thing that I'm aspiring to, if I'm present and aware in the experience that's in front of me right now, I'm good.
Hmm. That's where grace comes in.
Yeah.
That's where grace comes in. There's a story I tell when I get on stage, about the day that I was at my very worst, because, I'm up there to tell people how to be their very best, right? The traditional motivational speaker. And it's the first day of school where I'm trying to get the perfect photo of my perfect children and the perfect clothing and the perfect pose to put on, Facebook for my perfect profile. And of course, my kids didn't stop fighting long enough on that first day for me to get that perfect picture. And I spent the entire drive to school choking back tears, trying to figure out where I went wrong as a parent, and certainly where I went wrong as a working parent. Like, what sacrifices did I choose not to make? And the way that I tell the story is on the way home, I picked them up and I wanted to, yell at them and tell them they were horrible, terrible people because they didn't make me look good, right? But what they said was, "Look, mom, it was the first day of school. We were nervous. New kids, new teachers, new friends, new subjects. And by the way, you had a chapter due to your publisher and it wasn't going so well. So maybe you weren't at your best either." And rather than punish them, we had a do-over, right? We get up the next morning, we have breakfast, they took a shower, like everybody wins. My teenage boys didn't stink. And the way I tell the story is that it was in that moment that I realized that having the perfect family meant being in the state of grace where we could forgive each other and we could figure out who we are when we're at our very best, but also how we show up for each other when we're at our very worst. And it's funny because I never used the word grace ever in any place in my life. But when that word came to me as like, we gave each other grace, I actually can't say the word on stage without breaking up a little bit because
Yeah.
it really is such an ephemeral place to be and such a gorgeous, delicious place to be if you let yourself sit there, but damn, it's hard.
It is, it's I think it's the sweet spot between this too and this too shall pass.
Yes, that's a lovely way to put it. Jonathan, I could talk to you all day. I look forward to all of us being vaccinated and coming out to Boulder and visiting you.
Mm.
Hopefully, taking one of my kids out to college. Let me go out there. Still waiting for those admissions notes. Where can people find you if they want to learn more about you, Good Life, and Sparketypes?
Yeah, I mean, you can find me, I'm basically Jonathan Fields anywhere you want on social media, at Jonathan Fields, goodlifeproject.com and sparketype.com.
Excellent. Thank you so much for
My
such a
pleasure.
terrific conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.